So I'm going to talk to you guys today about making your Elixir API accessible to non-Elixir developers and external audiences. So a little bit about the goals. I want to talk about team collaboration tips and how to better communicate between departments, best practices when working with other groups who are not necessarily server coders, and different tools you can use to communicate information about your API. What I'm not talking about is different API transfer protocols, how to use REST, CRUD, all of that. I think we've seen talks on those before. So a small disclaimer about me is my primary background is JavaScript. And so when I started working with our Elixir API, we had a pretty unique setup. We have an umbrella app with a few different gen servers. We have ETS caching. We use RPC protocol. So we do a lot of things in our way. And a lot of the questions I had were not really Googleable questions. Like, what does this gen server do? Or how is our data structured? Or what are the different params that I can send to this endpoint? So my motivation for doing this talk was to try and get other people working with Elixir to be able to better communicate that information. So since I know JavaScript, this is where I come from. Here's Chris talking about the complexities of JavaScript at ElixirConf last year. So our tech stack has Elixir with Phoenix for the server. We use JavaScript and React on the front. We have Ruby and Rails legacy API. We also use Java, Kotlin, Swift for our mobile applications. And we also have a Unity SDK. So effective collaboration between engineers that are working on all of these different things is critical to our company's success. So one thing that really catapulted my understanding of Elixir is that we combined our JavaScript and Elixir repos. And the reason we did that was several things. First and foremost, computer systems don't operate in isolation. And there was a lot of trends recently to make many microservices that do different things. And it makes sense in some cases, but you really need to know where your separations of concerns lie. And a lot of the time, macroservices work better than microservices if they're connected to the same database, if they're working with the same information, and they need to communicate with each other a lot. So this forced all of us to be a bit more full stack, and we put our JavaScript repo inside of the Elixir repo, and as you can see, JavaScript is still about 50% of everything. And so when we did this, I needed to know a lot of the very basics of Elixir. And so a lot of great things came out of this, actually. On the front end, we had built a lot of integration tests, and every so often they would fail because of changes in the server, because you're not returning a key that we're expecting, or other little things. But now that those front-end tests are being deployed in tandem with the server code, it makes everything very smooth. And because the front-end that I'm working on is the admin tool that interacts with the database and adds things for our partners, it's really important that the front-end that is the user interface for connecting with the database is in sync with what the server is giving back. And this made our QA a lot more efficient because it was clear where each of the problems were coming from. We didn't have like a lot of different microservices changing things behind the scenes. And it means that we both sides end up understanding the basics of each other. But before you run to combine your repos and get everything all in one and make everybody learn everything, there's a few things that you need to know. First things first is culture. Full stack goes both ways. And as we are learning Elixir, and Elixir is a relatively new language, you guys know that we have to be evangelists about learning new technology and being excited about the good tools that we have. And we do that with our company with code schools that Desmond runs. We do a lot of pair programming, and we sit with other developers and find out what text editor they're using and what shortcuts they have to make everything easier for a code base that you're not necessarily familiar with. I am now doing tickets that have both Elixir and JavaScript, but in my peer reviews, I'm very careful to make sure that someone who has been working with Elixir a long time will review the more complicated parts that I've added, and the same goes with JavaScript. We want to make sure that your team is able to approve the things that are relevant to their primary background. And this isn't for everybody. You have to have the right kind of company culture to expect people to work on two completely different ends of things. But if you do go this route, I want to talk about like a few of the practical things that have really helped me. So the first thing is make sure your README has basic instructions. And this is not only good for like JavaScript developers who are trying to learn Elixir, it's good for new employees, new hires, if you have partners that will be using this. And one important thing to add to your README is all of the commands that your CI tool uses. So that way when you're pushing up code, if something is breaking on the Elixir side, it's easier to run it locally and know like, and be able to replicate that same error. One thing that has helped me a lot is having scripts that delete and reset and seed the database. Because when you're working on a UI, you always are changing the data and going through the same steps over and over. And it helps a lot to be able to nuke out all of the things that you did before and start fresh with a new set of data. So having scripts that do that quickly makes my workflow a lot easier. And in general, if you have like a lot of gen servers or an umbrella app, just a description of what each of the different pieces does and how they communicate with each other is very helpful. So you guys are really lucky that, and we all are, that we work with Elixir and it has a code formatter that ships with Elixir. And I wish JavaScript had a consistent formatter also. So make sure to take advantage of that. I've loved having Dialyzer on our application because when I first went in to try and fix things, I would get these errors back that are like, your function returns a struct, which will never be a tuple. Okay, fine, I can fix that. So that's something that's been really helpful for me, and it makes the data flow a lot more understandable. So when I first started working with Elixir, I think the most important thing I learned was how to debug and how to run the server with the console, io.inspect and iex.pry. And that helped me a lot because if all I wanted to add was maybe one key to the serializer, then I could step through and find out like where that was missing. Understanding Elixir messages is also really important, and we're very lucky that a lot of the error messages are pretty clear. And another thing that is a good task to work on first is porting over old functionality, because a lot of the complexities and business requirements and things you need will be already determined, so you won't have to go back and forth on that, and you already have like a working example of how it works, and then you just get that into Elixir. So for us, combining has been awesome. Like, I really enjoyed learning both sides of things, and I think that the same can be said of our Elixir developers too. But it's not for every company. So what I want to talk about next are a couple tools that you guys can use to communicate the information about your API that maybe isn't necessarily Googleable, and tools that would be more useful for maybe partner developers or external audiences. So generating your docs, mix docs, is something that ships with Elixir, and we're really lucky to have that. So make sure to keep that updated. Credo is a good code format tool that will help you make sure that you have documentation for every module. XUnit also ships with Elixir, and testing is very helpful when you don't know exactly how an application is supposed to behave. The tests keep things consistent. And of course, code coverage. So a little bit more about testing. From my perspective as a front-end engineer, the tests that I find most useful are integration tests that basically test like, this is what we're giving the server and this is what we're getting back. Like, unit tests are important and they're fun to write, but in terms of like communicating what your application actually does, high level and integration testing I find very helpful. And so when you combine those integration tests with code coverage, it's very powerful when you use it with this tool that I want to talk about called Bureaucrat. So Bureaucrat is a tool that lets you generate API documents using your existing tests. How awesome is that? It's relatively painless to integrate, and I'll talk a little bit about the implementation here. So one great thing about setting up the API documentation to run off your tests is that you can use fake data. You can make up whatever data you want, and then you can give that out and not have to worry about actual information in your database. And then the next thing you do is you know how to set up an Elixir test. You build the connection, and then here we have our internal function that makes the actual request, where we tell it what kind of a request it is and give it the parameters and the headers and everything else. And then this next line where you're piping into doc, that's from Bureaucrat. And basically doc will look at where this test is called and give you a lot of information about the test and the information that you're sending and receiving from it. So in this example, every test has a describe block and then a test description. And when it comes over and generates the API documentation, the describe description and the test description are printed out to the markdown file. So you can see it right here, product list returns a list of products. Other things the API documentation will know from where that doc is run is which module it relates to, and it will tell you that as well as giving you a link to that module. And here's an example of what the requests and the request body look like when they are printed to the markdown file. As you can see, it'll give you the headers, the body, the methods, everything you need to know, as well as the same for the response. And knowing like the data structure of the response and the shape of the data is extremely helpful for when you're building out user interfaces. Okay, so my favorite thing about Bureaucrat is that it prevents documentation drift. And we all know how much of a headache that can be when you're trying to implement something that docs are really outdated. But if you have the documentation actually tied to a test and a connection and code that's running in your application, it's very powerful because the documentation is not going to be drifting from what it's actually doing. Another huge bonus to Bureaucrat is it's something that you should already be doing. And a few other things to know about it is that it's optimized for a standard REST protocol, and it uses Swagger format. So you can kind of change these things around a little bit as you like, but right out of the box, it has a very standard format, which is nice. The next tool I want to talk about is called Postman, and it has 6 million users worldwide, so I imagine a lot of you have already used it or know what it is. And the reason I bring this up is because it's a language agnostic tool, and it's very useful for, say, integrating with a partner who doesn't know anything about Elixir or who you are not sharing your code base with. And basically what you do is it gives you a really nice user interface for sending requests and seeing responses, and you can write tests within Postman based on what you previously sent and seen. You can also make API documentation with it, and a lot of this is free. So let's talk a little bit about how that's set up. So here's an example of a request in Postman, and as you can see, I've circled a few environmental variables, and those can be configured in your environments. A couple common variables I have here are like the host and the token. So basically the host or the domain name where what your website is going to be the same across like all of your requests. So it makes it easy if you have that host there, and then you can switch between, say, a QA environment and a sandbox environment and see how those different things are responding. And the token is something that you don't want to be typing over and over, just like all of these data variables and parameter variables. Another variable I have here is protocols. Maybe you want to see what it looks like between HTTP or HTTPS and see if it's behaving the same. So this is what an example looks like, where you will type in the JSON information and hit respond, send the request, and then you'll get the response back in the JSON format that it's being returned in. And with Postman, you can create a collection of requests that basically describe like all of the endpoints that your application uses and what the information you send and receive is. And you can do this automatically where you just click through your app and it'll generate requests within Postman, and then you just alter those and save them to collections like I've done here. And then you can publish these collections and it'll give you a link to share with your partners, which is really nice because it'll tell you kind of how to make those requests. And I think we've been using it for some of our mobile developers to understand kind of what the information we need to send and receive is. Okay, so another thing I want to talk about is just to think outside the box, think about each other's perspectives and what kinds of things you can add to your repo that would make it easier for other people to use. One thing that made our project easier was scripts to run the front-end tools from the root of the project. My boss made a Google Chrome tool that makes reading RPC requests easier. So in general, like every system is different. So think about like what would be good for your system in particular. So here are the resources that I used, links to Postman and Bureaucrat, and also the book I read that was really awesome, Adopting Elixir from Concept to Production. So thank you very much.